Lovely friends, it's Emma here, just the girl who loves Elvis. I hope wherever you are in the world today, you've managed to find a gentle little pocket of calm. Maybe you've made yourself a cup of tea. Maybe you're curled up somewhere comfortable. Maybe Elvis is already playing softly somewhere in the background. And if that's the case, then I think we're already in exactly the right place to begin today's story. Because this episode is one I've been especially excited to sit down and share with you. Not just because of the people we're talking about today, but because today marks the beginning of something new here on the channel. A series that has been quietly sitting on my heart for quite some time. A series where we step gently into the world of Elvis Presley's films and the wonderful women who shared the screen with him. Now, when people talk about Elvis's co-stars, the conversation often becomes rather dramatic. Hollywood rumours, sensational headlines, stories that have grown larger over the years. But here, in our gentle little corner of the Elvis world, we tend to look at things a little differently. Because when you listen carefully to the people who actually knew Elvis, a very different picture appears. Kind, respectful, warm, and occasionally just a little mischievous. Which, if we're being honest, probably made life on a film set rather entertaining. Because Elvis Presley with a sense of humour nearby? Well, I suspect a few rehearsal rooms were a little livelier than normal. And today, we begin this series with someone very special. The lovely Ann-Margret. Now, my lovely friends, let's gently step back together for a moment. Back to the early 1960s. Hollywood is still operating under the classic studio system. Film sets were busy environments. Lighting rigs overhead. Directors discussing camera angles. Costume racks lining the walls. Musicians preparing for recording sessions. And somewhere in the middle of all that activity, you would find Elvis Presley. Already one of the most recognisable entertainers in the world. By this point, Elvis had already made a number of films. Most of them musical comedies. Light-hearted, colourful, entertaining. And while those films certainly had their charm, they also begun to follow a familiar rhythm. Elvis arrives, he sings a few songs, there's a romantic storyline, and by the end of the film, everything resolves happily. But then something interesting happened. Because onto the set of Viva Las Vegas stepped Ann-Margret. And my goodness, did she bring energy with her? Ann-Margret was simply not another actress arriving to play the romantic lead. She was a performer. The kind of performer who walks into a room and the atmosphere changes almost immediately. She could sing, she could dance, she had theatre training, and perhaps most importantly, she had presence. The kind of presence that lights up a room before a single line is spoken. Now imagine that moment. Ann-Margret arriving on set, opposite Elvis Presley. You can almost picture the reaction. Two charismatic performers, both musical, both energetic, both very comfortable on stage. And somewhere nearby, I imagine a director quietly realising something. Well, this is going to be interesting. Because when two performers with that much rhythm meets, things can become lively very quickly. When Elvis and Ann-Margret first met during rehearsals, People on the set later described something very simple. Ease. Not fireworks, not dramatic Hollywood tension. Just ease. They seemed to understand each other. And that actually tells us something important about Elvis. Because Elvis wasn't simply a singer stepping into films. He was deeply musical. He understood rhythm, timing, energy, and Ann-Margret had that same instinct. So when rehearsals began, something very natural happened. The two of them began responding to each other's energy. Little smiles, quick glances, tiny shifts in timing. The sort of things performers do when they realise the person opposite them is truly listening. And that, my lovely friends, is exactly where real on-screen chemistry begins. Now I will admit something here. If I had somehow wandered onto that set in 1963, I suspect I would have been standing quietly in the corner, trying very hard to behave like a perfectly normal human being, while internally thinking, well, this is quite possibly the most distracting rehearsal environment imaginable. Elvis Presley on one side, Ann-Margret on the other, music playing, a film crew trying very hard to look professional, and me somewhere nearby pretending I wasn't completely fascinated by everything that was happening. I suspect my concentration would have lasted about 3 seconds. But when the music began, that's when something special appeared. Because Elvis Presley had rhythm running through his bones. Honestly, if someone tapped a rhythm on a nearby table, he'd probably start moving before he even realised it. Because music wasn't something Elvis simply performed. It was something he felt. And when Elvis Presley starts moving to music, the room tends to forget it's supposed to be a rehearsal. And Ann-Margret shared that same instinct. So when rehearsals began, the atmosphere on set changed. The energy became playful, creative, joyful. Two performers discovering they genuinely enjoyed working together. And when that happens, the camera notices it immediately. Now, my lovely friends, once rehearsals properly began on Viva Las Vegas, something rather interesting started happening on set. Because rehearsals on musical films can sometimes be quite technical. Marks on the floor, camera movements to remember, lighting adjustments, choreographers quietly counting beats in the corner. But when Elvis Presley was in the room, things rarely stayed purely technical for very long. Because the moment the music entered the space, Elvis responded to it instinctively. A shoulder would start to sway. His foot would begin tapping. And before anyone quite realised what was happening, the rehearsal had quietly turned into something closer to a performance. And that's the thing about Elvis. Music didn't simply cue him. It moved through him. Many of the musical numbers in Viva Las Vegas required energetic choreography, fast movement, precise timing, plenty of rehearsal. Ann-Margret, having come from a strong dance background, approached these rehearsals with enthusiasm. She worked hard. She practiced carefully. She understood the technical side of performance. And Elvis? Well, Elvis approached the rehearsals with rhythm. And occasionally with just a little mischief. Because Elvis had a playful sense of humour. the sort where you could almost see the next joke forming behind his smile. And if someone nearby could keep up with that humour, well, that simply made the whole experience more entertaining. And Ann-Margret clearly could. Which meant those rehearsal rooms often had a wonderful lightness to them. Not stiff, not overly formal. Just two performers enjoying the creative process. One of the most famous moments in the film appears in the musical number, The Lady Loves Me. Now, if you've seen this scene recently, you know exactly why people still talk about it. Because it plays out almost like a playful conversation. Elvis delivers a teasing lyric. Ann-Margret answers with equal confidence. He smiles, she raises an eyebrow. He sings another line, and she sends one straight back. And somewhere in the middle of all that, the audience begins to realise something. These two performers are genuinely enjoying themselves. Not just performing, enjoying. And that kind of energy travels straight through the camera lens, which is why the scene still feels alive today. Now, I will say this gently, but if you watch that scene closely, there are moments when Elvis looks as though he's enjoying himself just a little too much. That particular Elvis grin appears. You know the one. The grin that says, I am absolutely about to tease someone. And Ann-Margret being far too quick to fall for that sort of thing simply gives the teasing straight back to him, which makes the entire number even better. Because suddenly the scene feels spontaneous. Almost as if the two of them are sharing a private joke while the audience watches. When the film was finally released in 1964, audiences noticed something immediately. The film felt vibrant, colourful, full of movement. And a great deal of that energy came from the dynamic between Elvis and Ann-Margret. Because when two performers genuinely enjoy working together, the camera captures something special. Not just choreography, not just dialogue, but presence. And presence is something that audiences feel instinctively, even if they can't explain why. But beneath all that lively energy, something quieter was also present. Professional respect. Elvis admired talented performers, musicians, actors, dancers, people who truly loved their craft. And Ann-Margret clearly did. She worked hard. She brought enthusiasm. She took the role seriously. And Elvis recognised that. He didn't try to dim her presence. He didn't try to dominate the screen. Instead, he allowed the partnership to breathe. And I think that generosity says something important about his character. Because performers who feel threatened by strong co-stars often try to pull the spotlight back towards themselves. But Elvis very often seemed comfortable sharing it. And that generosity is something many people who worked with him later remembered. Now, my lovely friends, there is something rather fascinating about this film. Because sometimes the camera captures something that even the people involved didn't entirely plan. A moment of genuine laughter. A reaction that clearly wasn't written in the script. A glance between performers that feels completely natural. And when you watch Viva Las Vegas carefully, those little moments appear again and again. The smiles between Elvis and Ann-Margret. The playful rhythm of their dialogue. The tiny pauses when they seem to be reacting to each other, rather than simply delivering lines. And that sort of natural energy is very difficult to manufacture. It appears when performers feel comfortable, when they trust each other, when the atmosphere on set allows people to relax and just enjoy the work. And Elvis had a remarkable way of creating that kind of environment. Something else becomes quite clear when you look at Elvis's career more closely. He seemed to genuinely enjoy working with strong female performers. Women who brought energy. Women with personality. Women who were not simply standing quietly in the background of a scene. And Ann-Margret certainly belonged in that category. She was vibrant, confident, playful, full of life. And Elvis responded to that energy very naturally. Which perhaps isn't surprising when you think about Elvis's upbringing. Because Elvis grew up surrounded by strong women. His mother Gladys, his grandmother, the woman in his extended family. They shaped the warmth and loyalty people later recognised in his character. So when someone like Ann-Margret arrived on set, confident and talented, he didn't appear threatened by that at all. Instead, he seemed to enjoy the dynamic. And if I may share a small observation here, I suspect Elvis probably appreciated the fact that Ann-Margret could keep up with him. Because Elvis had a mischievous side. The sort of humour where you could almost see the next joke forming behind his smile. And if someone was nearby was quick enough to respond, well, that simply made the game more enjoyable. And Ann-Margret clearly understood that rhythm, which meant scenes often felt like rehearsal performances and more like two people enjoying the moment together. Now, in many ways, Viva Las Vegas became one of the most memorable films Elvis made during the 1960s. Partly because of the music, partly because of the colourful Las Vegas setting, but very largely because of the chemistry between the two leads. Even critics at the time noticed it. They described the film as lively, energetic and fresh. And when all the critics seemed to notice the same thing, you know something interesting must have been happening on screen. Because audiences instinctively recognise chemistry. But they may not analyse it consciously, but they feel it. Of course, time has a way of adding layers to stories. Rumours grow. Headlines become more dramatic. And sometimes the quieter truth becomes harder to hear. But when you listen to Ann-Margret herself speaking about Elvis in later years, the tone is warm, respectful, affectionate, not sensational, not dramatic, just appreciative, and that speaks volumes. Because the people who actually shared those experiences tend to understand the reality far better than those observing from a distance. And this is where something important about Elvis becomes clear once again. Because the way someone treats people the way they work with often reveals a great deal about their character. Film sets can be demanding places, long days, bright lights, pressure to deliver performances. And when someone behaves kindly in that environment, people remember it. Which is why so many stories from Elvis's career return to the same themes: warmth, humour, generosity, the sense that he genuinely enjoyed the people around him. And when you hear those qualities described again and again, from musicians, actors, friends, staff. It begins to form a picture that feels very real. Now, my lovely friends, when we step back and look at the story of Elvis and Ann-Margret with a little distance, what we see isn't a scandal. It isn't dramatic Hollywood gossip. And it certainly isn't the kind of exaggerated story that headlines sometimes try to create. Instead, we see something much simpler. Two performers meeting at exactly the right moment in their careers, sharing the stage, enjoying the creative energy between them, and respecting each other's talent. And honestly, that kind of partnership is far more interesting than any rumour could ever be. Because genuine creative chemistry, the kind the audience still feel decades later, almost always grows from something real. Respect, joy, and a shared love of performance. One of the things that has always touched me when listening to people who actually worked with Elvis is how often the same description appears. Kind, warm, thoughtful. People speak about him noticing things. A nervous musician. A crew member who looked tired. A young fan who travelled a long way just to see him. And Elvis often responded in the same way. With kindness. Now, of course, he was human. He had difficult moments like anyone else. But when you listen to the people who knew him, what you hear most often is warmth. And that warmth appears again and again in stories from the film sets where he worked, including Viva Las Vegas. And if we're being completely honest for a moment, I suspect Elvis enjoyed working on this film quite a bit. Because not only did he get to perform music, not only did he get to drive fast cars in the story, but he was also sharing scenes with someone who clearly enjoyed the playful side of performance as much as he did. Which meant the atmosphere on set was probably, let's say, a little more livelier than usual. And knowing Elvis's sense of humour, I suspect there are moments when he simply couldn't resist teasing someone nearby. Which, if you ask me, probably made those rehearsal rooms even more entertaining. When audiences watch Viva Las Vegas today, what still stands out is a sense of energy between the two leads. The music, the colour, the movement, and the playful rhythm between Elvis and Ann-Margret. But underneath all of that, there is something quieter that gives this film its lasting charm. Balance. Because neither performer is overshadowing the other. Neither is trying to dominate the moment. Instead, they share it. And that sharing creates something vibrant. Because creativity thrives when performers respect each other's talents. And I think that is exactly what we see in this film. Sometimes when I watch Viva Las Vegas now, I find myself imagining what it must have felt like to sit in a cinema in 1964. The lights dimming, the curtain opening, and suddenly there on the screen, two young performers bursting with energy. Elvis, already adored by millions. Ann-Margret, sparkling with confidence and charm. And for a couple of hours, audiences were transported somewhere joyful, colourful, full of music and laughter. And perhaps that is one of the loveliest things about cinema. It gives people a little escape, a little happiness, a moment when the world feels brighter. And when I reflect on the story of Elvis and Ann-Margret, what stands out most to me is something very simple. Elvis respected talent. He admired performers who loved their craft. He enjoyed working with people who brought creativity and energy into the room. And I think that tells us something really important about his character. Because people will feel secure in their own abilities, are usually the ones most comfortable sharing the spotlight. And Elvis, despite all the fame surrounding him, often seems surprisingly generous in that way. Which brings us back to where we began today. Because this story is only the beginning. There are many remarkable women who shared the screen with Elvis during his film career, each with their own personality, their own talent, and their own unique dynamic with him. And exploring these stories together, I think will give us a richer understanding of the man behind the legend. Not through rumours, not through dramatic headlines, but through the people who actually stood beside him. And perhaps that's why stories like this still matter today. Because kindness leaves echoes long after the cameras stop rolling. So thank you for spending this gentle time with me today, my lovely friends. If Elvis's and Ann-Margret's partnership has ever stood out to you, I would truly love to hear your thoughts. So take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and keep a little Elvis magic in your hearts. I'll see you again very soon.